the way that I'm going to moderate this panel. The way that it's going to run today is each of us is going to talk a little bit about the trajectory of our careers as writers and how that creates a kind of map of the self. So each of the four of us will do a short talk, very short talk, and then I have a list of questions that the panelists and I have developed for each other that we've sort of been in virtual conversation about for the last while. So folks will get a chance to answer those questions, and then if we have time at the end, I have a couple that are just for you all. And then we'll have a little bit of time at the very end for questions from you, from the audience. So I wanted to just let you know that we have somebody here who stepped in for us at the last minute. That's Suzanna down at the end, who very, very graciously, when one of our folks couldn't make it today, needed to bow out, I said, please, Suzanna, can you help us? And Suzanna is that person who will always help you. So she may be a little bit less prepared, because the rest of us have known about this for how many months? I don't know. And so she's doing it on the fly. So let's all be gentle and kind, right? So thanks, Suzanne. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of overview what we're trying to do here, and then I'll talk a little bit about my map of self, and then I'll just kind of we'll move down the line, as it were. So what we're trying to get at here is the fact that one joy of being an avid reader is discovering fresh voices, new to and in love with literary self-expression. But there's also joy in following the growth of a voice over the course of an author's lifetime. Each book is like a time capsule, the representation of an individual's understanding of the world that is forever preserved on the page. So we'll feature writers in various stages of life and career, and we'll be reflecting on all the people that we have been over the years, charting the maps of the self. So that's kind of our goal. And I'll just start with myself, because I am a little bit different than everybody else on this panel in that I have one book out and everybody else on this panel has multiple books out. So that's why I'm moderating, I think. Anyway, my first book, hopefully the first of many, is called Unnatural Selection, a memoir of adoption and wilderness, and it was just published last year. And it explores the decade that I spent as a wilderness guide while I searched for my biological parents, whom I was separated from at birth in a closed adoption. It asks the question, can we be whole if we're denied access to our origins? And it ends up pursuing that question and developing an expanded definition of family. A little bit about it. In my 20s, I was a residential outdoor educator, a National Park Service ranger, a wilderness guide, and a search and rescue captain in the desert Southwest. These jobs, which were really more like lifestyles, created a map in my life, one of the natural world, particularly backcountry spaces, and how interacting intimately with the natural environment can be an agent of healing and transformation. It maps the human need for belonging, both from an adopted person's perspective for belonging to community, belonging to other people, but also belonging to landscape. The idea of landscape as a surrogate for lost family, landscape as the body of the beloved, and landscape as a living, breathing entity in which we're in relationship with. So more on that later, and there's lots of overlapping between what these folks write about as well. So now we will hear from Daniel Summerhill. If you want to just go ahead and get started and tell us about your map of self.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to start, you guys can hear me okay? Yes, okay. I'm going to start by reading a an excerpt from a speech that James Baldwin gave at UC Berkeley in 1987 called On Language, Race, and the Black Writer. Writers are obliged at some point to realize that they are involved in a language which they must change. And for a Black writer in this country to be born into the English language is to realize that the assumptions on which the language operates are his enemy. And I frame that or use that to kind of frame my little talk, because I came to language from a place of assimilation in many ways. I grew up in a non-affluent place in Oakland, East Oakland, California, but my mom sent me to school several cities away. And so I spent most of my time riding a bicycle between several cities to try to get to school. And it really speaks to W.E.B. Du Bois and when he mentions the double consciousness, right, of a young Black person. And I'll read a little bit of what he kind of describes that as. A peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in an amused attempt in pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warning ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength and alone keeps him from being torn asunder. From this must arise a painful self-consciousness, an almost morbid sense of personality. And so it really does speak, Andrea, to your point, can you be whole if you're denied access to a part of yourself? And so when I went to grad school and I came with that same kind of idea of code switching and actually, trying to assimilate and use a language that was foreign to me, what I realized is that I wasn't getting at what I was trying to get at in my poems. And so I had a brilliant mentor who had the opportunity of just seeing, for the first time in several years, Nicole Torres Dutton, and she wrote back to me in a packet of work I sent to her. She said, Daniel, I want you to find and create a hybrid beast of a language. And so when I approached Divine, which is my first collection of poems, that was the kind of attitude that I wanted to approach the page with. The idea of creating a hybrid beast of a language that speaks to James Baldwin's idea of trying to be a fugitive in a language that I'm accustomed to, right? And so, I got through, Divine and really kind of wanted to dive even deeper into language and what it meant for me to explore my own understanding of language and my own approach through my own Blackness and what that meant for language. I'm going to read the introduction to the collection, Divine really quick, because I think it speaks to the idea of language and approaching language from that way. Sorry. Here we go. My grandfather was a carpenter, which meant he could make magic with his bare hands. I once watched as he split a 2x4 in half to build the front and rear axles of my go-kart. I was 7 and languaging. This lesson was on etymology. I knew English, like prison, didn't add up when I realized the term sawdust pays more credence to the destroyer than the destruction. I realized saws didn't have dust at all, just blades. And dust was only dust because it was at the bottom. The same way Ta-Nehisi Coates explains, black is just someone's name for being at the bottom. I didn't see this as a metaphor for language in '98, but I did when I set out to write these poems many years later. The dust being my language being my body. In this collection, I explore this metaphor through the lens of East and West Oakland in the early 2000s, through the beat of East 14th and the trauma of adolescence. I hope to magnify a Black boy's proximity with death, God, A Tribe Called Quest, and Shakespeare. I hope to let the homies in through the back door in these poems, to sing and celebrate the time mitigating our low-hanging pants and Air Force One crease preventing walks. I hope there is a prayer in these pages that allow them to talk to God in whatever language they feel comfortable with. There are many ways we share experience, and music is among the greatest. Biggie or Pac or Frank or K-Dot in particular. The we and we gonna be all right lets us know Blackness is not monolithic. Our music sings our glory. These poems showcase Black as a congregation, a collective, a fist, with enough holy to grab heaven by the throat. These pages offer the black backdrop as a communal space to make sense of fire, entrepreneurship, retribution, and revelation. Poems know what they want to be and know how they want to arrive there. In Divine, 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 it is a BART train or a mongoose bicycle with a busted chain and a boy learning how to speak while riding them both. A boy who knows his name and knows what his mother's lips meant when they discharge it each time. A boy who recalculates his worth each time a black body stops breathing. A boy who believes in survival as a tool for vengeance, survival as salvation. What is more divine than a non-dying thing? My people die, but never die. Our bodies may go, but our tongues don't. Language is proof that we're alive, proof that we're divine. And so I just wanted to read that because, again, that was my mindset when entering Divine, 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 and the language that I approached it with. And it's still an evolving thing. And so even with my students, the first thing that I try to do is to figure out what their voices have and how they can bring their voice, their entire selves, to the page. And so that was my attempt in the next collection, Mausoleum of Flowers, which took a lot out of me, but I think birthed a new hybrid beast of a language, as Nicole Therese Dutton would say. And I'll stop there to allow other folks to kind of chime in and hear what they have to say too.
That's great.
Thank you, Daniel. Go ahead, Dzvinia.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you both. I've been blessed to have 6 books published by Carnegie Mellon University Press, and I've written up notes on the books to just sort of show how my thread kind of went and where it almost snapped at some point. But I would say that the 2 subjects entering into my first book, and as of my most recent one in 2018, A Bad Harvest, have always focused on what it means to be Ukrainian/American. When my first book came out, it was so liberating to have that term, Ukrainian American, because you weren't really one and you weren't really the other. You were sort of this in-between land, and that hyphen almost became like this bridge connecting the two. I thought 20-some years later that writing or having the subject matter, that at this point I'd have, the exploratory freedom to look elsewhere, but guess what? I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, because being Ukrainian American certainly has very potent meaning in these troubling and tragic days. But anyway, and the second subject is that my family always works itself in, and I think that's an emotional component because I always say I was raised in a minor key. My parents were refugees. My grandmother left her son behind. She held me, she called me an orphan, she rocked me, she sang to me in minor keys, and I was very, very aware early on of this heaviness and what it meant to leave somebody behind. So I think psychologically for me, as long as I'm writing about them, I'm holding on to them. It may or may not be true. But anyway, so my first book was called A Handful of Bees, and I asked what breaks the silence. So it was exploring my identity as Ukrainian American, but it was also triggered by my father's passing from cancer. We were shocked because we grew up very much, the ideas of like bad luck and curses, and hey, my parents had survived the war, so clearly they had already had their punishment. So this was not something that was going to happen to our family. And, but it did. And so it triggered other subjects in my first book, which would be my Catholic upbringing, because I felt like if you prayed enough, you would be protected. It's my childhood sort of mantra. And also questioning, who am I as a woman? What am I good at? I was going through a divorce. So everything that I thought was going to be sacred and holy suddenly wasn't there. And that broke the silence and found me in an MFA program in my late 30s, and my first book at 40. So I'll just briefly read a synopsis of the other books. So that was in 1994. In 1999, I published Edge of House, and the subject was motherhood. There's a shift. My home and my family are now my country. And life is constituted by a variety of boundaries, and life is transgressing or respecting these boundaries. And I meant emotional boundaries, just the whole, seriousness of raising a child. but also I think I remember writing to Eleanor Wilner and saying, "Oh, I feel like I'm neither coming nor going," and she said, "That's because you're doing neither." So Edge of House was almost as far as I went. Was very much homebound. My kids grew up. 2003, I published Except for One Obscene Brushstroke, and it was Yahoo! Sex in the Suburbs. And now the body is a pleasure-seeking country. Use of candid, confessional, flat voice. I was very influenced by Brooks Haxton, The Black Raincoat, where he talks about this fetish black raincoat, and it's like he's saying, like, I love my wife, I love, my home, but it got this raincoat. At the end, he tosses it over an edge, but it just sounded like somebody was talking next to me. But the subject that where they were going was just really like new to me. And I felt also maybe because my kids were no longer super dependent on me, I mean, they were still young, this whole other notion kicked in. Like I've earned the right to, keep the dirty diary or whatever that is. Then, oddly enough, in 2008, Convertible Night Flurry of Stones, The Blessing Lies Next to the Wound. Just as I was exploring all of this fun, the body as, sensing, pleasure, all of that, I experienced my journey and treatment of breast cancer. So now the body abruptly shifted from this Yahoo to a lethal country. My body's going to potentially kill me. How do I deal with this? And it certainly invited me back to look back at my father's cancer and thinking well, lightning doesn't strike twice because my parents were refugees, so they've earned their time in hell. But no, guess what? Here's more. And I thought, my father, and this often happened with that generation, I suffered so you don't have to suffer. Well, guess what? You're going to suffer too, and that's just the way it rolls. Having not both survived that has been 27 years. Yay! I revisited my Ukrainian American past through the lens of objects. The question became what I inherited, what we inherit, object and cultural identities, and the question, where does the sacred live? The title poem, Silver Tones, my father's silver tone guitar, held here by my daughter, is sort of the central metaphor, central narrative poem. And basically, I'll just say briefly, my father used to play all these minor keys on the silver tone, heavy wooden guitar. And we grew up with all these sad songs. And even though it said silver tone on there, I always thought that this was a guitar that my father carried on his back, emigrating, barefoot in the winter, but the guitar came. And it was about 15 years ago that I thought I really want to see what's up with the silver tone, so I took it to a local music store. And the guy said, oh yeah, silver tone, the everyman's guitar. There are a ton of these in the 50s. You could catalog, order them for the Sears, great guitar, not worth saving, blah, blah, blah. And so I found out that my cultural heritage, this sacred object, was used by Peter Townsend to smash when he didn't want to damage his good guitars. It was also Chet Baker's first guitar, was I think Hendrix's first guitar, but it had this whole history that had nothing to do with my family. And I started thinking well, how many more of these things do we do? Do we hold on to these myths, these folklores that we take on to define ourselves? And how private do we make that life, thinking that we're making it universal for ourselves? And then my most recent book was called Bad Harvest, and this refers actually to the Stalinist famine, the Holodomor, in the early 30s, that upwards of 4 million people were starved to death. It was genocide, but not even acknowledged as such until fairly recently. And I wanted to explore something that would get into a really dark part of my cultural background, and that for me was the cannibalism that had occurred during those extreme times. And to wrap this up quickly, it was such a long process. I started reading Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, and I thought this is too intense. I need an emotional PhD to go through this material. But I used it as kind of the central piece of a triptych, which would be this is cultural genetic memory. My grandmother was certainly aware of it, my mother to a lesser extent. And then flanked on one side were prose poems that had to do with more immediate familial history. My uncle has been in Siberia, etc. Prose poems that were more storytelling. And then on the other side flanked were failed marriages, current politics, things that were really in my collective bad harvest. So again, I think all those subjects, each book writes one long poem, I think, But anyway, thank you.
Hold that here. Hi, thank you for inviting me, thank you for having me. It's an interesting thing because as I was listening to these great talks, I was thinking about how I wish I had known about this question sooner, not because I would be more prepared, because sometimes not being prepared is okay, but because since yesterday, I've been thinking about this idea of the me in my books and why and how my books have changed and how my obsessions have never changed, but how I've changed the way that I've written about them. And I think we all have obsessions. And I was thinking about, I was actually thinking about a dear friend of mine who's a wonderful poet. If you haven't read her, you should read her, Patricia Smith. Because if you read her early books, she has poems about the very same things that she has in her later books. And Incendiary Art is like the most amazing book of poetry I've ever read. And she really found form, right? And so she found form to contain her stories. And her earlier books are great too. But you look at the progression of her stories and her obsessions are the same. And I thought about that in my own work. And I thought, well, where did my obsessions come from? And what I was really trying to do early in my career is to hide myself. And then I thought, well, why was that? And part of it is because I grew up with an alcoholic father and a mother who was in denial and tried to hide it all the time. And so when you grow up in a family like that, you either learn how to keep secrets or you tell everybody everything. And I have done both. So I started by not wanting to be a writer at all because my alcoholic father was a writer. But what does he say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Even though I had a degree in biology and I loved the natural world and I thought I was going to be a park ranger, I gravitated toward writing. But I was taught not to tell my truth. So I started writing fiction. So I have a master's degree in writing fiction. And then I discovered poetry. And I was like, oh, now I can lie to the reader, but they don't know, or I can tell the truth and they can think I'm lying. This is like the best genre in the world, right? Because nobody knows if a poem is fiction or nonfiction, and it doesn't really matter. And so I wrote and published 4 books of poetry. I don't have them with me. I would have them if I had known I was going to show you. Look at my books of poetry. But the books of poetry have the same subjects as my memoir, as my 2 collections of essays. They're the same story I've been trying to tell over and over and over and trying to find form. And so if any scholar ever decides I'm going to write a dissertation about Suzanne Roberts, it'll be super easy. It was written for them, right? And so I published my 4 books of poems, and then I published a memoir about hiking the John Muir Trail. But it's also really about body issues and identity and my dad and so it's not just about hiking in the wilderness, but it also is hiking in the wilderness and my love of the natural world, which has also evolved. And it's not only evolved, that one hasn't evolved just because of me, it's evolved because the world is changing, right? And so when I used to write 10, 15 years ago about wonder, now I write about environmental grief. I live in Lake Tahoe and we have wildfire, we have smoke season now, we don't have summer anymore. And so there's a lot of sadness and grief, but it's still my obsession with the natural world. And so I wrote this memoir, and I'm also obsessed with different places and place, and I wrote Bad Tourist, which is a book of travel essays, but again, it's also about other things. It's about the way in which our cultural blind spots make us the bad tourist. even when we're trying really hard not to be. And what I realized between these two books, because the conversation has changed, like, I don't write about my own white privilege in this book because we weren't having that conversation then. And part of being privileged is not having to recognize your privilege, right? And so we all like think we can recognize our privilege, but that's part of privilege, is we don't even recognize it. And so I didn't have that conversation in this, but I try to start having that in this and bring in humor as a way in to more serious subjects. And my latest book, Animal Bodies, on Death, Desire, and Other Difficulties, it's again about sort of my obsessions, but it's also really breaking, there's an essay in here called Breaking the Codes. It's about breaking silences. So I have written about having an abortion. I have written about my own infidelity. I have written about, inviting some boys over to a party and my girlfriend getting gang raped and feeling for 40 years like it was my fault. So I've tried to write into all of the secrets, and part of the reason I could do that is because my parents are both dead. So, I have so many students who say, I can't write that, what will my mom think, what will my dad think? And it's like, well, write it now and try to write it, but you might have to rewrite it. Like, keep trying to write it, but it's gonna look different, right, after those people are gone. And now I wanna write a novel because I feel like my silences have been broken. I've told all my secrets, and now I'm just really tired about talking about myself. So I'm hoping, right, that I'm sort of back where I started. I'm like more interested now in maybe writing some fiction again. So that's sort of the journey of my me in my work. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. So now I'm going to pose some questions to all of us. And I think we'll just go down the line in this order, just to keep it easy for my adult brain. So the first question, as I mentioned before, the panel developed these questions for each other. So the first question is, although the act of writing often happens in solitude, the process is often much more communal. How would you all describe your growth with relationships within the literary community? How has that changed? So I will start. When I finally came out of the backcountry in my late 20s, early 30s, I worked really hard to develop connections with other writers, and I started out in writing groups and then teaching poetry to kids with an organization called California Poets in the schools, and getting hooked into a certain writing community that way. And publishing in lit mags, and did a master's degree in poetry. And then I moved to Philadelphia and had a very pivotal experience in which I was invited into a writers group that was not a writing group, and that was new to me. We did not critique each other's work. We were there to support each other in our careers as writers. And it was just a really powerful thing to have 8 or 10 other people cheering each other on through whatever we were trying to do, and have shared resources. And it was all women, and so it was this really powerful experience that created a really intense bond for all of us. And we were together for about 10 years, and then I moved, and a couple other people moved, and so we've kind of dispersed, but we still have this bond that holds us together, and we see each other on Zoom and in person when we can, and still are supporting each other. So it's been a really important thing.
Yeah, sure.
Add to that?
So I began writing in solitude, and when I grew up, I didn't have any friends who wrote poems. We played ball, and I found writing because my older sister is also a poet, and she got married and moved away to New York with her new husband and left behind a photo album of poetry that she wrote. And one poem in particular that I still remember was Wishing Upon a 747. And because of light pollution, you can't see stars from the inner city. So she wrote that poem. I found it as like this young person finding out who I was going to be. and wrote poems. And you know, it's all through middle school and in like the 9th grade, my friends are like, "Yo, come play ball." And I'm like, "I gotta finish this line, like whatever." So anyways, I share that to say, you know, it actually started out like a lot, you know, in a kind of solitudinous kind of way. And as I, you know, grew up and performed during, you know, slams and the whole, you know, spoken word scene, I met a lot of like brilliant thinkers, brilliant minds, brilliant writers. And so it was through that I kind of built my network and kind of grew with the literary community. And then now, thinking about it, it's, you know, showing up for writers is much more of a human thing for me. Like, how can I show up for you in a human way? And I think that feeds like the kind of literary efforts that my friends that are writers are trying to put forth. So I think about it like in a much more human way, right? Rather than like, how can I show up for you in a literary way? No, how can I support you as a human being, as an empathetic, living, breathing person? And I think through that is how we've built relationships. And that's how I built community around my folks is through that.
I had a similar situation as Daniel's, that I grew up in much more of an isolated situation. My parents did not really encourage us playing with American kids. We had like a few Ukrainian kids that we saw maybe 3 times a year, and they did not let us speak Ukrainian, English at home. So I spent most of my time on 10 acres of beautiful meadow in Ohio with like 7 dogs and 3 cats and 1 horse, and a thick diary that I basically talked to on a regular basis. I didn't really enter into a writing community until in my mid-30s, when I gave myself permission to go to grad school in writing, and I met a lot of people at Warren Wilson is where I went. And when I graduated, Martha Rhodes and Jane Brox and Helen Friedman and I decided, let's do something, you know, how about a publishing company? So we got together and we came up with the name 4-Way Books, and Martha and I founded it for about 8 years. Helen stayed about a year, and Jane stayed for 2 years because their books really took off. And it was, I thought that's what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be publishing. But what was really astounding to me was that I had this fantasy of like how in touch that would put me with writers, but it was really running a business. It was, you know, back then we didn't have anything. I had like this fax machine that cranked out things. I was accounts payable, I was accounts receivable. All our marketing was done with, hey, we're going to send you this questionnaire, and then I'm going to key it in. And it was just so much like learning how the post office likes to receive things and everything. And then every once in a while you'd have like the 2 calls that you'd say, hey, guess what? You're the winner. And you'd hear somebody like screaming and like, you know, everything popping champagne. And that was really wonderful. It became harder for me to do as the Marshfield office, where I live in Massachusetts, shifted more over to New York. And I found myself, and the 4-Way Books is up and running beautifully, as it still is to this day. And I sort of fell into accidentally a job teaching at Stone Coast, replacing somebody who canceled the last moment. So that allowed me to have experience in teaching at a graduate school level. And then I started being invited to come as a guest teacher for undergrad. And I've been basically, you know, I've been teaching at Pine Manor Solstice program, and been doing that for about the past 10, 12 or more years. And I love that because, particularly with the low residency MFA program, I love the one-on-one mentorship. You know, working with somebody for 5 months and really getting to know that person. It really fed into like the writerly desires that I had in terms of communicating with people. Since then, I retired from Providence last fall. I'm a writer in residence for the Solstice MFA program, but now I'm giving my heart over to translation, and mostly because of the Ukrainian crisis. I was invited to translate a Ukrainian poet, Natalka Bielizarkiewicz, right when quarantine set in, and I thought, wow, this is a real experience here. With all this isolation, I'm really getting into somebody's life, and I just, I'm really enjoying that responsibility of bringing other voices as best as I can to the English reading audience. So that's been my trajectory.
translation is such important work. Thank you. I think for me, I was an only child. My sisters are 17 and 20 years older than me. So as a child, I had to like go up to people and be like, will you be my friend? And I basically still do that, you know, and I still am like, oh, maybe we know the same person because, you know, you do performance poetry and I have a friend who does that. You know, I'm always trying to like find common ground. And there are a lot of people who hate coming to AWP because it feels like, oh, I have to network. But I think of network as a noun and not a verb, right? Like I am a part of a network. Like I'm in a room with people who care about writing, who care about literature. Like how awesome is that? That doesn't happen in my life in Lake Tahoe very often. So for me, I love being here with you because you are my network. And so I do things to create that in my life. That's how I met Andrea. I put together a all-women writing retreat in a haunted house. And it really is haunted. You can come ask me later, I'll tell you about stories. But because I don't want to scare people who don't want to hear it. But anyway, like Andrea and I met because she lived in Davis and that was close enough and I thought she might want to come and I don't make any money doing it. I just rent the house out and we have a potluck and we all write together because it's worth so much to me to be in a house with other people who care about writing. And so, you know, it's just a wonderful time. And so that's what I would say. Think of network as a noun and not a verb. And, you know, and I saw it in a lobby bar last night, like people jockeying to like talk to like the person they thought they should be talking to. And I'm just thinking, you know what? This amazing graduate student next to you is more interesting than, I mean, sorry, but you know, it just, you know, they love literature too, and that's the important thing. Okay.
Thank you, Suzanna. So our next question is that writing is often instructive and reveals things to us that we didn't know before. What have you learned from your writing since you began? And I'm just going to tell a very short little vignette, which is I learned about how genre can really change things. So I mentioned I got a graduate degree in poetry. I wrote a poetry collection. It was pretty much about being adopted and being in the wilderness. I turned it in, defended my thesis, graduated, and I was like, I think I need to write that as a memoir. I think I need a narrative arc that's stronger than I can make in a collection of poems. And so I sat down and started doing that. So, you know, that was a huge thing because I had a lot of pushback from myself. I'm like, you just finished a degree in poetry writing, and now you're going to try to do something that you have never taken a class in. Cue the Amazing Writers Group that I mentioned before. But just the idea that genre, you know, is so important in terms of reaching the people we want to reach in the way we want to reach them. So that's what I have to say about that.
So I learned, I'm a son of Baldwin, I like to think, and so I learned mostly that my poems are very telling of falsehoods, and James Baldwin says we write poems to tell the truth, and we don't always know what the truth is, but we do know what's a lie. And so what I've learned through trial and error, mostly through many drafts, many revisions, is that my poems are always after the truth, and by the end of the poem, we might not get to the truth, but I think it's the chronicling, it's the journey that is the poem, and that's always after the truth. And so that's what I've learned mostly is that journey of excavation towards the truth.
I've learned that it takes a village of voices to raise one authentic voice. I always felt like, particularly my first book or something, you know, I had like a style, I had images that I would go back to, and I still do. But I have found as I've been writing more and more that, like, for example, Bad Harvest has the Holodomor, but it also has humorous poems in it. I didn't want it to be all just about genocide, or did I want the book to be all just a humorous book? And I think that those two voices can coexist. They're a way of surviving too, relief from one, you know, to the other. you're just thinking about like, well, what is the voice that I'm using now versus the voice when I call up my husband and say, I'm done, do you want to meet across the street? The voice when I think about how my day went, the voice that I dream, and the voice that I wake up with is very different than the voice at around 5 o'clock. So I've just really been paying attention to all those different tonalities and allowing some of them to go more immediately on the page as opposed to kind of through revision shaping into what my comfort zone voice. So that's something that's becoming intriguing.
Okay, I've learned 3 things. One, that it's the work. That's what's important. It's the time that the seat of your pants is in the seat of the chair and that you are writing, okay? No, that is the work, and that is what's important because you do not have control over anything else. And there is always something more to lose at, all right? Oh, you got an agent, awesome. Well, they can't sell the book. Oh, you sold the book. That's awesome. Oh, nobody's gonna buy it or nobody's gonna review it, all right? So it's the work. You have to take joy in the work. And I'm talking to myself here, but I'm using the collective you, right? So that's what's in our control is the work. The second thing I've learned is I have to be patient. The book will reveal itself to me. The essay will reveal itself to me. And sometimes it takes many years. When my first memoir was published, it took me 20 years to write, and I gave a reading, and a guy in the audience raised his hand, and he said, why did it take you so long? And I said, are you a writer? And he said, yeah. And I said, you should know. It takes a long time, and it's okay. Because whatever needs to happen in your life may make that book richer, more interesting, make that poem better, more interesting, may give you the ending. And the third thing I've learned is that the more I learn, the less I really, really know shit. So that's it. Hope I can say that recording. Okay.
I gave you permission to swear.
Thank you.
Also to the
Okay.
to you too. All right, so here's switching gears. If your body was a country, what qualities would define its citizenry? So I would say that if my body was a country, it would be a wild country, and its citizens would be edge species, which are organisms in overlapping biomes who dwell in 2 different worlds and in the overlap at the same time. And it's an ecological concept that I really have glommed onto because it makes a lot of sense to me as a person who is adopted and grew up in 2 worlds. And the interesting thing about edge species is that they're both more resilient for that living on the edge of 2 worlds, but they're also more vulnerable because they're not adapted perfectly to either of those 2 worlds. So how about you, Daniel? Your body, your country?
Yeah. If it would be defined by the folks' relationship to the land, stewardship to the land, in a non-imperialistic, non-environmentally destructive way. So relationship to the land and stewardship of the land.
When we got these questions back, I thought, who came up with this question? And it was me, and I couldn't answer it. So seriously, it's like it sounded good as a question, but how do I know? But anyway, the head would have to finally make peace with the heart and stop saying, oh, the head versus the heart. Secondly, wakefulness and restfulness would have to be equally respected, something I have trouble with. And sometimes the citizens would get restless and set bonfires, and I would look to my eyes to tell me why. That's it.
On this 4th day of AWP, my citizens are dehydrated, they're tired, and they want to go outside.
Good question, Dzvinia. When we write, we often imagine a receptive reader or listener. Has that imaginary reader or listener changed over the course of years and publications, and if so, how? So I'll just give a short answer to this one because I don't have as long of a publishing career, but my memoir has a certain reader in mind. It's I wanted to explain to people who aren't adopted or haven't been touched by adoption, the particular brand of loneliness that adoptees experience, especially when they're from closed adoptions in which they're not allowed any information about their origins. So we do write to a target audience, and that I really had that for my first book. But the book I'm working on now has a completely different audience, and I think that as a writing teacher, we talk about that all the time. Like, who is your target audience? What kind of background information can you assume they have? What do you need to tell them? What kind of language or jargon or vocabulary do you use? So, for my next book, it's much more joyful, and it's about women's friendships and the outdoors. And so, if that's my target audience, is people who want to experience that joy.
Cool. So I don't think it's changed between the books. When I write, I'm writing to the homies, to the folks I grew up with, and I try to do so, and it's difficult. I try to do so in a language that's not foreign to them, that they can read and understand and unpack and see themselves in. Because if the stories that I'm telling, they're not able to see themselves in it, then what am I doing? And so they have to be able to find themselves in it. And I was at Elizabeth Azevedo's. They did a panel yesterday, and her response to a similar question was, I always think about it as banquet style, and where I'm writing to a specific, audience, and everybody else that comes along is just there to enjoy the food and the refreshments. And so, similarly, I'm writing to the folks who these poems are about, and everybody else is just, you're welcome for being able to kind of, read the poems.
Early on, and that probably includes my first 4 books, I would really have to psych myself into believing that there is a stadium of people who just can't wait to hear what I have to say, to kind of trick that confidence and have it, come more to the surface. I used to play really loud music, really loud rock, and just get caught up in that and kind of write my stanza and be like, "Thank you, Cleveland," just whatever it took, and then put it away before it's oh, it's just me. But I think over the years, I've become more confident because I've done the hard work, and I feel I've crafted my voice, take it or leave it, love it or not. So I think my audience is less judgmental. It doesn't need to be a stadium. It just needs to be my desk. And but I still, the criteria that I look for is I know I'm onto something when I feel totally confused and a lot of mystery, but at the same time feel absolutely clear-eyed at the same time. And those things come together. And that was kind of a feeling that I had with the very first poem that I wrote, that I knew, hey, this is a poem. And you get that feeling, and it's hard to describe, but you're onto something.
I know I'm onto something when I'm terrified. And so my first audience has always been nobody. It's always been, I'm never showing this to anyone ever. And I know I'm lying to myself, because then I'm like, oh, this isn't so bad. Maybe I'll revise it. And then my audience was my mother, because she was the president of my fan club and the vice president and the treasurer too. But she died. And so now I don't know. I don't know who I'm writing to. But I will tell you that since she's died, and she'd hate for me to say this, but my writing's gotten better. And I think it's because she isn't there saying, I didn't tell anybody about your abortion. I was like, I'm telling everybody, you don't have to. So I think for me, I don't know. I don't know the answer, because my mom's gone. But my first audience is always lying to myself that nobody will ever read it.
Yeah. Great. So now we'll finish up with a couple of questions that are just for you 3. So how have you juggled your time as your publications have gotten more widely received and the public demands, those of students and families as well, have gotten more intense?
don't know. I don't know. I have a daughter, a 6-year-old, she'll be 6 on Monday, named Genesis. Genesis, you're here with me, baby girl. And I have another little girl on the way. And I teach, and so it's tough. I don't know, honestly. I don't have a good answer. Many early mornings, late nights, or 20 minutes between whatever is going on. Or when I go to AWP, finding time early in the morning before panels to write or read. But really, it is a trial by error kind of thing with me lately. So I'm still trying to figure out my rhythm. But I know I'll find it.
I'm still looking for that. I was hoping to get like some really smart advice and answers here. I had my son at 38, my daughter at 40, and while I was pregnant between was when I found out that Carnegie Mellon had selected my first book. I kind of sent it on a lark thinking I'm not going to be doing anything anyway. But everything, we were trying to get 408 off the ground, and having kids in snowsuits and trying to be somewhere and getting books sent to some, from the warehouse. It was crazy. And the positive thing out of it was that I really felt that it taught me that whatever is in you is going to come out when it does. And I remember at the changing table, just writing stuff, and I thought, I've got 5 minutes to get this out. What do you really need to say? So I think it helped me that way. Now I have the luxury of saying, okay, I'm going to sit for 2 or 3 hours, which is never a good idea. But it's always been extremely difficult because for me, I don't have that sacred writing time. I always have to check my emails. And if a student asks me about something, my writing goes to the side and I get back to the student. So I'm still working on it.
I have some advice for you. You have to turn off your email and you have to protect your writing time. Yeah, no, you do. Okay, so nobody's gonna protect your writing time but you. And you have to surround yourself with people who protect your writing time and understand that's important to you. Even if you have to get a divorce. I'm sorry, but like my first husband was like, what do you mean? Let's go on vacation. I'm like, I'm not going on vacation. I have spring break. I taught full time for 20 something years. I'm going away down the rabbit hole to write. That's what I do. You have to be an employee to your art. And that's what I've learned. And so I wasn't getting enough writing time, teaching full time, teaching in an MFA part-time, writing, doing everything else. So I quit my full-time tenured job. Do I have an incredible amount of privilege that I could do that? Yes. Part of it was because my mom died and left me a house that I could sell. But I'm also renting my own house out and living in a van. And it's not a nice van, like one of the fancy ones. It's like a down by the river van. It doesn't even have a bathroom or a shower. So my husband and I are gonna live in a van. And we lived in a van all last summer and rented our house out because I am protecting my writing time and I am an employee to my art. And you just have to do it. So.
I combined 2 questions just for those of you, because they were similar. What did reflecting upon the arc of your writing career for this exercise here illuminate that you hadn't consciously realized before? And did looking at your life and your publications to prepare for this panel spark some future resolve for you?
Yeah, I realized I didn't have time to bask at all, and I want to find more time to be still and patient. And it's something that I've learned. I published 2 books in 2 years, and so there was a lot of writing that happened within a 3-4 year span, and then not so much outside of that. And so it's been interesting to think about what it means to be still and not be anxious to write. And one of the things that I've come upon is, writing isn't always pen and paper. Writing sometimes is taking a walk or cooking, or my grandfather, again, was a carpenter. So I like to think that I'm a poet because poetry is another way of using your hands. And so I'll do that. I'll go and make a bench out of, wooden pallets that I find on the back of a box store. And in that, I'm discovering that's the craftsmanship that I'm after. So I think allowing myself space, time, patience to bask and really live is also a part of the writing process. And so that's what I've learned through my very small arc of a writing career.
I think that's so important to acknowledge, because sometimes, when you are just working and responding to people, trying to help and all that, then you realize that you're just attached to that screen, and it's like, I look at my husband, it's like a real wood chopper and carry the water and all that. I'm so grateful to be reminded that, we are supposed to live and do other things besides the writing. I think what I've allowed myself to think at this point is that I haven't failed. I'm not saying that I'm there as opposed to there or there, but I think from childhood I had these scratched out things. I hope I can become a poet, since age 8 or something. It was a dream. It was like a vision I had for myself. But also I'm a hard worker. And there's always somebody along the way that says something to you that kind of sticks to you the wrong way. And I remember for me, it was an undergrad, I turned in my very, very slim, I don't blame the professor, poet, the first comment, but he kind of looked at me and said, "You'll never be prolific." And never is a word that comes to me in red. And so I feel like I surround myself with my books. No, usually because they haven't sold, I'm just kidding. That I kind of say enjoy, move forward, have faith, breathe. This is not a race against you. You don't have to prove something. And I think I'm actually being a little bit kinder to myself in that way, and that just feels really good.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you said that about being prolific, because if you look at some of my favorite poets come out with a book of poetry every 10 years. My friend Carolyn Forche, she comes out with a book every 10 years. She just wrote a wonderful, wonderful memoir, What You Have Heard Is True, which you should all read.
Thanks. So while you think of your question, if you have a question, we have a cool little mic standing right there. So if you want to just hop on up to it. While you do that, I'm just going to kind of recap a little bit some of the themes that were threaded through what everyone said. So it seemed like the pursuit of the whole self really connects with that idea of creating a hybrid beast of a language, which also kind of connects with what Dzvinia said about how being Ukrainian American in the hyphen, connecting to identities, all this search for identity, as well as what everybody's been talking about, breaking silence in various ways, code switching, deciding to stop code switching, choosing your audience, ways of, just ways that we speak to each other in order to be our true selves and to be empathetic with the rest of humans. So, wonderful conversation, everybody. Thank you. So yes, go ahead and ask your question, please.
I'm wondering, when you're talking about your ideal audience, I'm wondering, for any of you, does that include dead people, people, writers from the past, or people that you're in dialogue with, or your work is in dialogue with, that informs your process?
Great question. Who wants to take that?
Sure. I mean, especially the second collection, Mossing and Flowers, there's many folks in here that the book is in conversation with, from James Baldwin, Kendrick Lamar, Kanye West, to Frank Ocean, probably most explicitly throughout the collection. So I guess I wouldn't say that those folks are the audience for the book, but they are, I guess the conversation revolves around them and the art that they've created. So I guess in some ways, maybe perhaps I am thinking about them as I write the poems.
I don't know so much about audience, but more entering a conversation, right? And so the John Muir book, I was definitely in conversation with John Muir, trying to find my own sort of uniquely feminine vision of the wild. And then I started reading some female nature writers and coming into the conversation and saying things that they couldn't say during their time periods. Yeah.
I was going to say that I had, like response poems to various authors. I've done it with Carolyn Crochet, who I very much admire, and Mary Oliver, and even I mentioned Ukrainian poet Natalka Bielitsakivitz, who I co-translated this past year. In 2003, my opening poem to one of my collections was after one of her poems. So it's really amazing in time how things will then connect or come full circle. So,
for me, a lot of my writing was in conversation with people I didn't know if they were dead or alive, my birth parents, before I found them. So there was a lot of sort of assuming and wondering and hoping, and writing to them, writing poems to them, writing the first part of this book before I met them. So yeah, I think this bears out that we all do. Thank you. And did you have a question?
Yes, thank you all for being here today. I'm wondering how you all get over that uncomfortable cringiness / disassociation of past work that is your past selves that's already published or unpublished, but things that are already out there in the world and you're like, yikes, that is not me anymore.
Great question.
So I recommend that you read your favorite poets and their really, really early work, or writers, because I have a chapter about Emily Dickinson in my dissertation, and her first poems when she was a really young woman were awful, really, really bad. And even novels, a lot of writers will write a novel that is just, it's just not there because they didn't have the skills yet or whatever. And I'm thinking about Emily Bronte wrote a novel called The Professor that was never published in her lifetime, and it wasn't very good. But she rewrote almost the exact same story in her last novel, Villette, which is a masterpiece. And so I think for me, knowing that, it's okay. And what if you didn't get any better? What if your stuff got worse? I mean, I was just on a panel yesterday with a nature writer, Gretchen Legler, and she wrote me a message, oh, I just finished Almost Somewhere. And I was like, I'm so embarrassed. Because I wrote that book 10 years ago, and my new book is definitely my best writing. It's so much better than, I'm not saying, oh, don't ever buy Almost Somewhere, but I'm just saying it's so much better. But thank goodness it's so much better. What if it was worse? So you just look at it as a snapshot from your life. Yeah. It's like the bad hair in 8th grade,
I mentioned raising a family and writing, and just briefly, one of the things that I write about often is how my parents misunderstood the English language, and just fast forward here, my mother had been asked to give a talk at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Her English is very broken. She called me up and she said, that she had found a writer that she wanted to quote for this banquet that this deacon was being honored, and they invited her to speak. And she said, this man, Henry Miller, fantastic. And I thought, oh my God, Henry Miller. So I said to her, I said, what is it about Henry Miller that speaks to you? And she said, Dzvinia said something. She said this to me in Ukraine. She says, it's important to give with your heart and give with your soul. Most important, you have to give head. And I'm like, what? And she goes, give head. Share what's on your mind. And I said, that's not what that means. So I explained to her in Ukrainian, but then she said that I told her it meant a military canteen, so at that point I was failing as a translator. But in any event, this poem became quite popular and was published. So the past haunting was fast forward to middle school. My kids are in school, and they're starting to brag that Mama is a poet, and so they Max decided to look me up on Wikipedia, and there it is, on Google. My name, and then giving head, right below it. So a lot of explaining, it does get explained, but those are definitely not high points, and they come in and you just have to yep, that's your mama,
I'll answer that from a slightly different angle, which is, since I wrote a memoir, a lot of people who read it asked me, well, how do you feel about people knowing so much about you? You know, I kind of like Suzanne mentioned before, like breaking the silences, telling the difficult truths, breaking the taboos of things we're supposed to talk about and not supposed to talk about. And you know, so many people have asked me that, like, how can you talk about your struggle with infertility and feeling so weird being adopted and all of this stuff? And I don't really have an answer for that when they ask me, because I'm just like, how can I not? You know, it is cringy, it is uncomfortable. But so that's what we are as humans, that's our life, and that's how we, you know, that's how we come into better relationship with each other, is by making ourselves vulnerable, burying ourselves, showing that tender skin that's just healing from underneath the scab. So, yeah, head into the cringiness, right into it.
I'm also going to add, just be really careful what you send out. Like, think about it, right? Think about your future self. Like, am I going to be happy this is out in the world and published? So that you could also prevent the feelings later.
Let's give advice.
All right, so thank you so much for coming. We appreciate you being here. It's been delightful speaking with the three of you. And thanks to CavanKerry for putting this together.